Hey, and welcome to Rethinking Trauma and Transition. And the aim of our podcast is we challenge the stigma surrounding trauma and the healing through our podcast. We aim to empower those who are experiencing these challenges, providing them with the knowledge and the language necessary to embark on a transformative journey towards a more fulfilling life.
Yes, it's about challenging the stigma, challenging the commonly held beliefs, and hopefully opening up thinking around about these things.
Yeah.
So we're talking about today, Rich.
We're talking about identity and what surrounds identity, aren't we?
I think we are, and that's quite a big topic, but it's also core to, I suppose, pretty much everything we're talking about.
Yeah. So what we're going to talk about initially is we're going to go through Erikson's stage of psychosocial development, and then we'll go on to a bit about the 7-year cycles of life. How does that sound?
So give me a bit of context around those.
So it's about how people either develop or they don't, and how they can individuate from the family, from the overbearing parents, maybe, if you think about it this way. So you may find parents that are overly protective of their children, and they're not able to have an identity of who their self really is. It's almost like a cult kind of thing, where they're not able to escape from that family circle, as it were.
So does that mean then that what you're going to take us through just now, Rich, is almost kind of the cycle in terms of how our identity develops and what happens at each stage?
Yeah.
And some of the impacts, as you're saying, are the things that can potentially limit that development along the way.
Yeah. And yeah. So if there's no development, then we can't individuate as a person, as a whole being, as such. And then on the other side of that is then, if there's too much freedom, there's potentially, I would guess, is like a fractionation of the personality, possibly.
Well, is that also about, because I think sometimes when we're growing up, when we are to a certain extent born blank slates,
Mm-hmm.
and our experiences throughout our life will, in a way, give us pieces of our jigsaw, our internal jigsaw.
Yeah. And how we make that map, isn't it?
Yeah.
And how well defined that map truly is in certain areas, because some people would have a hugely well-defined map. In other areas of their life, it may be almost blank. So if you imagine you're looking at the terrain of a map and you're looking at hillside, there's going to be a lot of gradients going up the hill. So that's really very well defined as to scope and how high the gradient of that hill is. And then certain aspects of other people's maps is it's almost like a desert landscape or a massive lake where there's nothing really there for them to go off and work from.
So is that almost those gaps are like gaps in our experiences, gaps in our development?
I think it could well be both.
Imbalances maybe in our life, in our life balance.
Yeah. And that could be with parents' best interests, because somebody may have led a more of a secluded life, so maybe more out in the countryside, and they're going, right, at whatever age it is, I want to go off and explore the big city, big town, whatever's near them. And the parents are saying, ooh, I don't really want you to go there. Who are you going with? What are you doing? What time are you back? Because they want them staying there and they're scared of the potential that's going to happen. So they're not that child isn't then allowed to explore their own boundaries.
Well, that's quite an interesting debate, because I suppose when I was growing up, you would think nothing of going out and literally disappearing all day in the summer.
Yeah.
You would be playing in farmers' fields, you'd be climbing fences, you'd be getting well and truly mucky, you'd be getting into all sorts of risky situations and finding your way back out of them.
Yeah.
There were no mobile phones.
Nope.
Which probably for some listeners will have them looking in horror, like, what do you mean the life without a mobile phone? And your parents generally kind of just accepted that that was what kids did.
Yeah.
But that's very different from most children's experiences today.
Yeah, it's given a screen, look at it and play with that because it's easier. But I have heard there's a lot of adolescents who've grown up and they're just having a flip phone now because they don't want them. I'm guessing parents, and they know the dangers of being on social media all that time. So I think, as we mentioned before, we go through the stage of psychosocial development.
Yeah.
According to Erikson, we have from infancy, which is 0 to 23 months, is trust and mistrust. The virtues of that are hope. The existential question is, can I trust the world? And then examples are feeding and abandonment. So the child is thinking, will my parent feed me or caregiver feed me, or will they abandon me, leave me here? Because obviously they have no context about the world. They have no idea of how to survive, and they'd be just end up dead. Because they have no own agency, as it were. They're too young to be able to do anything.
Well, that's also where you could argue that when we are born, we are all born entirely narcissistic.
Yeah.
Because our experiences of life are such that we have no concept of anything else.
Yep.
And therefore our experience literally revolves, that first 24 months especially, is entirely or very much dependent on the caregiver for our survival.
Yeah, because obviously the child has, that infant has no choice in the matter, do they?
They've got no
They
choice.
have to implicitly trust their adults to do the right thing.
So what's the next after that?
Then we're moving on to 2 to 4 years, which is early childhood, and that is autonomy versus shame and doubt. So the virtue behind that is will. The question behind that is this okay for me? And so the examples are toilet training, clothing, self. So you can also look at it as well is when a child is that age and they go out to a park or they go out somewhere, the child is want to push those boundaries and go, oh, let's explore a wee bit. Then they come back in and go to the parent, that caregiver, is that safe for me? And then whoever it is, they go, yeah, that's fine. You go out, and they go and explore a bit more. Yes, a bit like comfort zones, isn't it? Explore that boundary, explore that comfort zone, and get into a bit of discomfort.
That would be really formative in terms of our approach to risk.
Yeah.
Because really what we're doing is we're learning about risk.
Yep.
Very basic level.
Aye.
Because that first exploration, there is no concept of risk.
No.
And therefore the caregiver is almost defining the limitations and the boundaries. So those are defined, and how tightly those are defined would have a big impact in terms of the child's development understanding of its capacity for risk.
Yeah. There is in Germany, I'm sure it's Germany, what they were doing was initially they had very safe and well-defined playgrounds for children.
Mhm.
So they had all that padding, all that matting going down, so children were able to have soft landings. But what they found out were actually children taking greater and greater risks. So they become actually more injured. And so they didn't, and when they're grown up, they didn't have that sense of risky behavior kind of thing. So what they started doing was building playgrounds where, say, the steps were differently spaced to go up to a slide. So that one would be, say, at spacing would start at, say, 2 inches, 4 inches, 8 inches, then maybe back down to 6 inches, etc. So the child would then have to make that judgment whether they can actually climb up the steps.
Mhm.
And then they'd also then, as well, is I believe these playgrounds used to go up to like 3 stories.
Mhm.
And there'd be ropes and stuff just slightly out of that arms, almost out of arm's reach, but close enough that the child would have to really think about, can they grab it?
Mhm.
And that's enabled that child then to develop with a sense of risky behavior and what is acceptable for them.
It's critical decision making as
It
well.
is, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, as you say, they're able to grow up making better critical decisions.
Yeah.
So we then reach the preschool age of 4 to 5 years, which is initiative versus guilt, and the virtue of that is the purpose. So as we're saying this, that's what we're on about now. So is it okay for me to do, move and act? And that's what about exploring using tools or such as making art as well.
So that's really us exploring that self-expression then, isn't it? And starting with
Yeah.
that too.
So whenever people look at children dancing, they're really smooth and the movements really flowing, even though it may look, you know, whatever it looks like. But as we get older as adults, we have all those stickiness stuck in us,
Mhm.
and we're not as fluid in our movement because we've learnt how to move, how to behave, and we're not as fluid generally in how our bodies operate because we have all these scars, if you will.
Is that also about learned experience though? Because as a child, children have
Baggage.
a lot less baggage, a lot
Mm.
less inner critical voices,
Yeah,
because those just grow and grow and grow as we mature. You know, they start being collected as a child and they're added on to.
yeah. And also, I think that can also be the narrative from parents.
Mhm.
So when I was growing up, is as a child, parents used to say to me, dancing is for sissies. We don't dance. So yeah, okay. And I kind of grew up with that belief.
Mhm.
Yeah, unless we're very, very drunk. That's another story. So moving on then, we school
But
age.
can I come back to that one, because I think that's a good point, and not your dancing skills, but
Oh, thanks. They're exquisite, I'll tell you that.
you word for that. Um,
Strictly don't come dancers for me, I'll tell you.
but that's about, if you look at the freedom within which children express themselves, the
Mm-hmm.
freedom in which they engage with the world, that they have a lack of, I'm going to use the word self-awareness, but I'm going to caveat that. I'm going to give it a bit more of a description because it's not quite what I'm wanting it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a nuance in there that we pick up as adults where that self-awareness becomes limiting
Yeah.
on us.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the child has no limitations on that. The child just responds and engages and interacts, and there's much more freedom because there's less, again, it comes back to that inner critic, less of those inner critical voices that maybe as an adult make us feel more inhibited or more limited in what we should or shouldn't do, for that fear of maybe people will laugh, what will people think, all of those inner voices that then that child is not encumbered with.
Yeah. A friend of mine, his wife, she was always jealous of a friend of hers. And this friend of hers basically had no boundaries set by the parents. She could basically come and go as she pleased. And so with parenting with children, they have to have a certain set of boundaries, but how restricted that is, I suppose it can be to a certain extent detrimental. So that's what I was going about earlier, was finding that sense of self and who I am. If those boundaries are too restrictive, you're never be able to explore and find out who I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if you have no boundaries, then where is that sense of self? Where does it belong? Is it internal? Is it external? Does it belong to someone else? Does it belong to me? Does it belong to my parents?
It's a bit like trying for size, isn't it? That's part and parcel of that identity and that growing up and that blending, as we try on different identities, different parts of our identity for size and see if it fits. And I think this is where, for me, and I don't know, I'd be interested in your views on it. Identity for me is very mutable, it's changeable.
Very much so, yeah.
Flux. And sometimes the level of change that identity experiences is more significant than others, but it is constantly changing.
Yeah, because again, stating the obvious, we're never going to be 2 years old again.
Well, I'm not the same person I was at the start of this podcast.
So physically, we change and develop, and we're never going to identify as that 2-year-old child, are we? We're going to go, oh, I'm now X years old, and this, quote unquote, is how I should be behaving in this world around us. So we then move on to our school age, which is 5 to 12 years old, and that is all about being industrious and inferiority.
So let's expand a bit on that inferiority.
Yeah, that's all about competence. Can I make it in the world of people and things? So that's all to do with stuff like school and sports. Yeah. So there's some people who always seem like the Billy Whiz, and they're always there. Yeah, first pick, you're on my team. And no matter what they do, is they are brilliant at playing sports. Where there's the other proverbial child who's got his NHS glasses on, can't see for toffee, and is always last to be picked because they're not seen as good at sport, or they don't have that seen competency in sports and activities. But when they're doing a different subject, maybe maths or whatever, they're absolutely brilliant and just able to crush that.
So is that where some of our boundaries, limiting or otherwise, start to settle in? Because we have boundaries in terms of our interactions with others, over what's acceptable to us and what's not, over what serves us and what doesn't. But we also have boundaries in terms of our own beliefs about ourselves and our own capacity.
Yeah, and that could well be formed by parents as well, I think. So the parents can have maybe that mindset is you go ahead, you can do whatever you want to be who you want to be. Or they may have that mindset is there's a lack of things in the world and you can't achieve anything because you're just not worthy. You're not a capable human being.
Or don't aim too high, don't aim too far.
Yeah.
That's not for the likes of us.
exactly. And I think that's potentially a safety mechanism because that is well out of that person's or those people's boundaries of experience. And they don't want to be seen as excelling as somewhere else or having someone who has achieved. Do you know that story about the bucket of crabs? So this father takes his child out to go looking for crabs. So they go out on a boat, and the father says to the child, "Is your mission today is to look at this bucket of crabs and tell me what you notice afterwards." So as they're hauling these crabs in, you put them in, chuck them in this bucket container. They come back. So these crabs, one decides to go, you know what, this really ain't a good place for me. It's not right for me. So the other crabs are going, well, actually, it's quite comfy in here. And so these other crabs then start pulling that one down that's trying to escape or attempting to escape.
Okay.
And so this happens, and this child is watching this bucket, this container with crabs in, watching these crabs trying to escape, and then the other one's pulling them down. Ends up going back to shore, and they said, so what did you notice about the crabs? And the response was, well, there's one or two crabs every now and again, and they want to escape because they realize that they're in danger, or they realize they're not in a good place to be. But the rest of the crabs, not realizing that, pull the other ones down because that's where safety, security, and comfort is.
Very nice analogy.
Mm.
Very nice metaphor, rather.
Yeah.
Because, and that comes back to what you were saying earlier about it being sometimes the limitations that others place on us, the that don't stretch too far, don't try to be more.
Mm-hmm.
Those are quite often protective mechanisms. They might not necessarily be experienced that way, but they can often come from a desire to prevent hurt, prevent letdown, prevent damage.
To fit in the quote unquote norms of society and the norms of our life experiences.
Yeah, and that's that sense of almost like zebra on the plains, where you don't want different, you don't want to be in the outskirts, you don't want to stand out in any shape, way, or form, because that makes you more likely to be somebody's dinner.
Mm-hmm. Well, if I remember rightly, these zoologists, biologists, they went off and tagged zebras or zebra, depending on where you live in the world. And so they were given like a red or a yellow tag. And because they had this identified marker, these are the ones that the lions or predatory animals targeted because they were easier to spot than in that herd of intermingling black and white. And so they were always wondering, oh, why is this animal getting, why are these animals getting all the time? Ah, that's because they have something distinguishing about them.
That made them different.
Yeah.
So for most people, primary school is quite pivotal.
Yeah.
And certainly I know from the work you and I do that time and time again, when we're having conversations about boundaries, about sense of self, about value, about self-worth, a lot of it is formed prior to us finishing primary school.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, as mentioned in previous podcast, is it could be that teacher coming along and going, well, yeah, what the hell is that? when you're doing some painting or some artwork, and growing up with the belief then is, I'm no good at art. I can't paint. I can't do anything like that. Or in my experience at school was, so I come up with a maths problem, and the teacher would be turn her head away from me.
Mm-hmm.
And go, so came up with the belief that I'm not very good at maths, because they didn't want to talk to me about that problem.
Well, that's like I had a belief that I was terrible at foreign languages.
Yeah.
But that was down to an experience where the teaching style that I was experiencing changed when I changed schools at a pivotal point. And when that changed, there was a period of catch up, but I wasn't given any support. I was just handed the books and said, work through them on your own. So I never caught up. To mask how badly I was in terms of behind everybody else, but I never caught up. And that left me with that sense of being terrible at languages. And that stayed with me right up until very recently, where I was placed in a situation where I had to try and pull together some very, very bad pidgin French, very bad, but found that actually I had a lot of fun doing it. It made me laugh. It made the person that I was trying to communicate laugh. And that experience then finally broke that belief pattern I had that said, I can't do this.
Yeah.
And it encouraged me to then explore other languages that up until then, you wouldn't have got me in the room to do.
Yeah.
And that was carried all the way through school.
Right.
I know. Yeah.
And the reason why I've never bothered learning any languages is because it was so dull, uninteresting. What is the point? It just made a topic that could be really interesting, able to communicate with people from wherever around the world to life-changing experience, and go, this is one of the most tedious, boring topics we could ever come across.
And I think I almost sense an entirely different podcast coming here, Rich, because that for me is about a lack of diversity in terms of how we share information within our education system, and that means then that the education system is set up for the majority.
Yes.
And what it doesn't then capture is the diverse range of learning skills and styles.
I think that's changing now to lesser or greater extent in the British education system. I don't know about the rest of the world. But obviously they have to have a standard and set criteria, and more towards the so-called academic stuff rather than lesser towards more the arty kind of things, because art and that sort of stuff is more subjective, whereas say doing math, science, that can be measured, that can be articulated, can't it? And there's no judgment within that. You either get it right or you don't.
Well, even down to how you could say the theoretical side is taught. So for instance, I know for a fact from my own preferences, if I can't see the practicality of something or it hasn't captured my curiosity, I will not engage with it. The thought of having to do endless amounts of research on an essay topic that I haven't chosen or that's been given to me that hasn't engaged my curiosity is just, for me, it's just utterly pointless. However, you capture my curiosity and I won't surface for days until I've solved that problem, until I've found the solution to that puzzle.
Yep.
And I will go in all different directions to find the source of that puzzle because my curiosity is engaged.
Yeah. And I think that's what school does, is stunt that curiosity. Because there's that old saying, isn't it? Don't let your education get in the way of your learning. Is it something along those sort of lines?
Well, I think there's scope there to appreciate more and have a wider array of how we engage in learning and how we
Yeah.
engage people in learning, because there's so much out there that's fascinating and wonderful that people don't get a chance to experience. And that's because of the beliefs that we build up over what we can and can't do at these pivotal moments because of the boundaries in which that information or that learning is given to us.
Mm-hmm. And so, as we're talking about identity, then the pivotal point really is our adolescence, and that's between 13 to 19 years old. And that is where we are then exploring our identity versus role confusion.
I
So,
think
the
is that
virtue,
you've got a bit of separation starting to come along too. So you're separating to form your own community,
yeah,
your own at that point.
yeah, and obviously, this is where the typical Kevin and Perry come in. Well,
Yeah.
push it back against the parents' ideologies and sets of belief. Um, do you know about crystal and fluid intelligence?
Tell me.
My Dan Cardamon, I think his name is, come up with it. So when we're a lot younger, when we're children growing up into whatever stage of life it is up until I think it's roughly 40, if I remember the top of my head, we have a lot of fluid intelligence. But as we reach a certain age, that fluid intelligence drops off. So it's all about exploring, making new ideas, making new ways of doing things. Because we have no concept as to such as what is right and wrong. But as we grow and we develop, our intelligence becomes then more crystalline. So we experience more and more stuff, and we're able to deal with, okay, I've dealt with that before, I can deal with that, even though maybe it's a slightly different situation. So a classic example would be firefighters.
Mhm.
Yeah, they're dealing with burning houses, burning buildings a lot. And for argument's sake, is to go, right, this house, yeah, is fine to go into because of this sign is this sign and that sign, and they're witness to recognizing what that sign is. And there'll be other circumstances where they go, we need to start this house or this floor because the signs are this will collapse. So that's where that crystalline intelligence comes in, is going, I recognize these signs, I've been here before, maybe not in that exact same scenario, but it's a very familiar one.
So that's almost like the concept of pattern matching, isn't it? So
Yeah.
we're matching our knowledge, looking for similarities too,
Mhm.
to speed up our response times and to aid in future decision making, really.
Yeah.
So that's each of those crystalline structures are really a previous experience that can then be drawn on to almost like additional information that
Mhm.
informs the next scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's also then could be considered as well learned behavior from people.
Mm-hmm.
Because if that firefighter hasn't got somebody there who's experienced with dealing with these situations, then they may end up going in a building that the floor's going to collapse on them and they don't know any better.
Well, that's also, isn't it? It's almost how we push forward the collective level of knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
understanding we have about our world and our environment
Yeah.
is through the sharing and the passing down of previous experiences. I suppose the knack in that
Right.
is in still retaining the ability to challenge that, because just because that's an experience at one point does not necessarily mean to say that that remains true as our experience of the universe expands.
Yeah. It's the old saying of the backhanded compliment is you're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And that's also recognizing, though, that truth is itself
Mm-hmm.
because it's contextually driven.
Yeah. The virtue of adolescents between 13 and 19 years old is fidelity. And that's the existential question is, who am I and who can I be? And that's, as we mentioned before, is exploring our social relationships. Then early adulthood is 20 to 39 years old, and that's all about intimacy and isolation. The virtue of that is love, and existential question that goes with that is, can I love? And examples are romantic relationships. We then move on to adulthood, which some of us never leave early childhood.
Well, I'm clinging on to my childhood for as long as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. Why not? Grow up disgracefully, isn't it?
Without a shadow of a doubt, that's my goal.
So adulthood is considered to be 40 to 64 years old, and that is generativity and stagnation. The virtue between that is care and can I make my life count? So the examples of that is work and parenthood.
So that's so what we've got is we've got almost like a progression, really, haven't we, of there's like a skills gain, conceptualizing that the world is bigger than just us.
Yeah.
Then move on to a point where we're starting to be aware of other people's boundaries and the limitations they are placing on
you'd like to think so.
Risk.
Obviously, there are people who have no sense of what is acceptable boundaries to other people because maybe they've not been brought up with those, or they want to exploit other people's weaknesses for their own gain.
And in amongst that, we're starting to collect a set of beliefs.
Yeah.
And now what we're talking about is really in that 20s phase is really the extension of those beliefs where we've got the value sets in there as well, which are coming in from teenage years through, and they're probably starting to settle down late teens, early 20s. And then that's then coming to that point in the phase of the 40s onwards where you've got the values, you've got the beliefs. That's where there's almost a point of review, isn't it, in terms of purpose?
Yeah.
Because at that point there's almost like, what am I achieving with all of this?
And I think what goes along with those formative values, excuse me, is cultural as well. So there be certain things that are acceptable in one culture, but if they move to a different one, they're not acceptable.
Yeah, and I think
all considered as acceptable.
Yeah, because you and I were having this conversation yesterday, weren't we? We were talking about the importance in terms of culture and community.
Yeah.
And I know that comes up a lot, particularly for things like people transitioning from one career to another. We see it a lot when we're looking at and working with people who are transitioning out of the military and into a civilian career path. And what comes with that is that loss of culture and community, because you're moving from one culture and community into another, but at the same point the one you're moving into, I think the phrase we were using was, it's a bit like emigrating, where you land in a foreign country and you don't know the social norms, you don't know the social language that's used, the abbreviations and acronyms no longer fit, and the language you're used to using that means one thing has a different context now.
Yeah. And some of those behaviors as well from the military context will be completely unacceptable in a civilian context. So, for argument's sake, is in the military, it may be considered fine and dandy to be going screaming and shouting at people because they messed up. You do that in a office environment, start screaming and shouting because you've got that level of management, you'd end up getting fired or getting reviews, wouldn't you, from the HR department or from the management department? Go, what the hell are you playing at? This is not acceptable in this environment.
Well, it's even I remember going to to Brunei,
Mm-hmm.
and I was delivering leadership training. And before I went, anytime I went to a different country, I would read up on the social norms and the social cues.
Yeah.
And Brunei was an interesting one because I had to learn to point with my thumb and not my fingers.
Okay.
Because in Brunei, if you point with your finger, it's very rude. You point with your thumb, it's not. And that was one of those I almost had to practice it for weeks before I went so that it wasn't so stilted, and to break my own habits, because I knew that that was deeply insulting in that culture.
Yeah. And in going on that then, as well, in the Middle East, is to show the soles of your feet. That's one of the biggest insults as well.
Yeah. And yet in other countries that will be seen as
that's fine.
No issue at all. And that's the same with any transition. That's why I think it's fair to say it is a bit like emigrating. Transition from one career or one part of our life or part of our identity to another. There is that point of total disconnect because you do not yet know what the new community and culture is like and what the social norms are within that.
Or you may have some idea, but it could be an alien concept. It could be not fitting within those boundaries or skill set that you've been brought up with. And again, it's how much of that from that other country, from that, are you going to bring in from that emigration into this new way of living?
Well, the other thing is how do you find out?
Yeah.
If somebody hasn't given you a country guide
Right.
or built one, how do you find out?
Well, exactly what I'm talking about beforehand is the two maps. So one area of the life is you're looking at the hillside and there's all those markers and all that very well defined is how steep this ridge is. You know, every 10 meters or so is a gradient goes up. So it gets really, really fine. And then you're looking at a waterway and there's or desert and there's very little there because it hasn't been explored yet. Or it could be the other opposite end of things is you're looking at a map and it's like a forest. There's no actual defined path as of yet. You've got to cut your way through that and go, actually, I'm in the wrong spot. I need to backtrack a wee bit, go back to a landmark that I know is familiar, make another path through that forest and explore again. And maybe it could be a case again, going back to another waypoint, another marker that's closer to your destination of where you want to be.
So it's almost like staging your exploration.
Yeah.
Always having a safe place to kind of touch base with to start that next stage of exploration from.
Yeah.
But
like
I wanted to pick up on that desert analogy because I think the other element within there for identity is sometimes our identities become very skewed in certain directions. And that means that because I do like the concept of our identity being like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
That is made up of different elements, different parts. But sometimes one of those parts becomes too dominant within the overall picture. And that's where, as a result, we might find that the other parts of our identity become so reduced to make room for this bigger area that we almost lose touch with what those are, or they become so reduced and so small that it's as if we're having to explore this for the first time again from that point of maybe the teenager or the primary school, because that structure isn't there anymore because it's been so swamped by another part that's been given dominance.
Yeah. Or you've got that again, going back to your jigsaw analogy, is it's been kicked off the table by the cat, and there's a house rabbit, and this rabbit's coming along and going, right, do you know what? These jigsaw bits are a bit tasty. So he just nibbled the ends off to interlock with the other bits.
You stealing
so that jigsaw will never ever fit again properly until it's recut or redesigned, rebuilt. Yeah. And also, again, going back to what I was saying about that two 2 to 4 years old age group is explore those boundaries again, and what is safe or not, what is safe is what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, and how far can I go to then come back and retreat into a bit of safety and go, okay, I'm okay for now. I'm going to explore that territory again, in and out.
Yeah, and I think the exploration skill is just as vital as anything else.
Yes.
We have to learn to explore and how to explore within the boundaries of our own sense of safety.
Yeah, and the safety of others as well, I think.
So we're now in that 40s bracket, aren't we?
We are, yeah.
That's that purpose and backwards reflection, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Well, not yet, because we've not reached to maturity, which is 65 until death. Obviously, people die at any age.
Yeah.
Again, I know it's stating obvious, but yeah, people think only, or generally tend to think bizarrely, is that it's only the elderly that die, but no, clearly isn't. So when we reach maturity, which is 65 and death, that is integrity versus despair. The virtue behind that is wisdom, or you'd hope that people at that age would be a bit more wiser and able to deal with things a lot better than what they were, but that's not obviously always the case.
Can I be wise and disreputable at that age?
You'd hope so, yeah.
Okay.
The existential question of that is it okay to have been me? And if you've gone on along with that, which is a reflection back on the life that you've led, and you've gone, holy shit, I wish I'd led a better life, then that is an existential crisis to go, I can't live that again. Where does that put that self of identity? And that's where that despair comes in then, because what better life or what better way of being could I have been if I had maybe a better childhood and better upbringing? Do I always keep blaming my parents for the way that I've lived my life?
Well, that comes back to, again, another conversation you and I've had. And that's about, I suppose, where we choose to spend our time, whether reflecting on the past and the impact the past has had on us, or whether that's about reflecting on our present and what we choose to do with the present.
Yeah.
And that means that for me, an event is determined by what I choose to do with it next. And sometimes it's taken me a long time to find something that I need, that I can use that experience for. And sometimes that hasn't necessarily been obvious, particularly when the experiences haven't been good.
Yeah.
You know, it's maybe taken me a while for me to find the placement of that says, now I know what I can use this for.
Yeah.
That will benefit me, that will benefit others, that I can make something better from this.
Yeah, I think that comes with wisdom. I think that comes along with being more comfortable within the self to be able to make those better choices.
I think there's also learning in it, and that as we navigate through life and we realize that we can make choices over what we do with our experiences next.
Yeah.
Then each time we find a placement for something that turns a negative into something that we benefit from, that others benefit from, then that is almost at the same point building resilience in us as well, because it means when we next experience that negative, a negative, then we already have the experience to know that I've already found a way to place others in my life, so I'll find a way to place this. I just have to be patient with it.
Yeah. And it's a story of, is it Sleeping Beauty? Who's the one who gets pricked with the needle when she's doing the
Sleeping Beauty?
Because because the parents don't allow for the wicked witch to come in, do they?
Mhm.
So she has a life experienced in basic comfort and pleasure, and no experience of the harshness of the world. So when she gets that little prick, she doesn't know how to deal with it and cope with it, and so she goes into a coma until Prince Charming comes along and sort of rescues her. So if we've not experienced the harshness of life, we don't have that resiliency and those skills to cope with those more troubling times or trying times.
Yeah, and I think that resilience building starts very early on, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
With the small disasters that we experience, because let's face it, our concept of disaster or negative events changes vastly as we
Oh
grow,
yeah.
because the scope of what is a disaster changes massively.
So
You know,
if you've got a brother or sister or a relatively grown up, and that other person has then gone, I'm having that toy, the whole world's collapsed, doesn't it? No, he's got my toy, he's playing with that, she's playing with that, whatever it is, and she's taking it away from me. The whole world is just absolutely devastated.
uh-huh,
And it's just absolutely, in the grand scheme of things, a completely minor thing.
yeah,
But to that child, it is,
every
yeah, it's
moment,
everything.
everything.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. And that's where our experiences as we grow allow us to contextualize these things, to give them the proper size and the proper importance.
Yeah.
But they teach us that even if this is a truly horrific experience for us at this point in time, I will find a way
Mm-hmm.
to, re-
But then,
to replace this.
right, but if we've never experienced that kind of thing, we're going to not be listening to people. Like we said in the previous podcast, is going down the trauma Olympics route. Is I've split my fingernail, and the whole world's going to collapse.
But that's because we don't know that it won't yet.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
haven't learned that, and we learn that in small pockets, and those pockets grow as we
Mm-hmm.
grow.
Yeah.
And each time we experience another one, it gives us an added layer of resilience there and an added sense of understanding over our
Mm-hmm.
capacity for that.
Yeah. So there can be is very wealthy children or children who grew up in very wealthy families. And the parents always constantly work. They've got a nanny to look after and all that sort of stuff, but never been brought up with life skills for argument's sake.
Mm.
So when they do go out into that world, they don't have the life skills to be able to know how to wash up or know how to boil an egg for argument's sake. And that's again, is people don't really consider it's another form of neglect.
But you could argue, though, that that's also part and parcel of what happens when we transition
Mm-hmm.
from a role that has also been a lifestyle,
Yeah. Yeah.
because all of the norms change and because of the parameters of that. And you can see some of that um for that military transition again,
Mm-hmm.
where because of the all-encompassing nature of it, because of the pre-built community and culture and the structures within that,
Yeah.
then you can spend a very significant part of your life during which normally you would be gaining those skills with no need to do that. You're gaining other vital skills instead that are essential for your role,
Well, essentially survival not only of yourself,
but the others around about you.
but those around us. Yeah.
Yeah. And those are the priority, but that means then when that part of your career path changes, then that leaves the gap where there's suddenly the organization that was providing everything else is no longer there, and you have to provide that for yourself. You haven't.
Yeah. And by and large, unless somebody's joined the military at a later age, do not have that skill set.
No, they haven't needed
You
to.
never had to. We never had to have that because everything has been provided for. So We never had to go and look for a dentist, never had to go look for a GP, never had to go and cook a meal per se. Back in the old days, that's changed a bit now. This is in British forces anyway. So meals are always provided. That pay was taken out the pay packet. The rent for the accommodation was taken out the pay packet, and all that sort of stuff. And everything was given up was, hey, beer tokens now. Yeah.
And each of those are parts and pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. And those are maybe some of those very small pieces that have been overshadowed by something else.
Yeah.
And as a result, they now have to find a way, we have to find a way as that individual to grow and nourish those other parts, because those haven't had the attention they need.
Yeah. So then that desert is not the blank, or the less blank map there is, it becomes a more fulfilled environment.
Or I think
It changes the perspective. It's no longer a desert as such. Maybe the grass is growing into that desert and rebuilding that into a better landscape.
The shape of that piece changes. The
Yeah.
shape of the piece that is that desert changes.
The rabbits no longer gnawed the edges of that jigsaw.
Yeah.
Well, they fit slightly better because it's not been so chewed up.
And to go back to the rabbit metaphor, I did recognize you nicked my metaphor there. I saw that. The point on that, though, is when we have significant changes, it can feel, and that happens a lot when we have traumatic experiences, when we have major shifts in our life that could be maybe, for instance, a divorce, maybe a house move, maybe a major career change. It can feel like that jigsaw's been blown apart. And as you use the choice of a house rabbit, quite interesting. There's connecting parts of those jigsaw pieces. It can sometimes those get lost.
Yeah.
In that implosion of identity. And we spend a huge amount of time trying to recreate the jigsaw as it was before. When in actual fact, what we have is an opportunity to create something different.
Yeah.
And while it's still a challenge, when we wrap our head around the fact that we no longer have to recreate the same picture that was there before, but can build something different, then that helps us move forward. That allows us more scope, because we no longer have to try and fit pieces together that just won't.
There is another model we can explore as well. So Rudolf Steiner, his model is a map that cycles for every 10 years to the age of 70. Yeah. So ages from 0 to 7 is going from oneness with mother to growing autonomy. So again, that's about the exploration of finding out who that self is and that self-identity.
Exploring that sense of risk and what's safe and how you explore your environment.
Yeah. So in the early life, as we've mentioned before, it's all about distinguishing between that child's self and the mother or the parent. So it's all about that exploration again. And then growing up to find out how far they can push those boundaries, kind of thing. We're looking at then is from 7 to 14 is a fight for and commitment to life. So we're again looking at pushing the boundaries, exploring a bit more, unproverbial things like getting off, having illnesses appear such as mumps, measles, chickenpox, and surviving from that. So if obviously we don't survive from them, we're obviously dead. I know, state the obvious again. Take some t-shirts with that.
Well, not unless there was going to be a zombie apocalypse somewhere in this podcast.
So then we're maturing from that age. Then it's Steiner says we go from 14 to 21. And this is where all the world emotions, raging hormones, and sexuality come into play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, which we already touched on. He goes then from 21 to 28, play that turns towards responsibility. So that's when a lot of people obviously get married, have kids, children, buying a house, rent. And so in a lot of states, circumstances when we are in a military, it's all about that single life, living the quote, quote, best life that we can, going out on a piss and doing all that sort of good stuff. So there's no real responsibility in a social sort of circumstances, but there is obviously a great deal of responsibility in that work-life balance or that work environment, because you may have a man or a woman that's say around 23, 24 years old, and they're signing for millions of pounds worth of bits of kit. They've got responsibility for the lives of others that are looking after. So there's a huge burden to be carried with that. But on the other side of things is there's virtually no responsibility with regards to money, where it comes from, the kind of lifestyle that's being led as well. Then we move on to 28 to 35, which is the body in full bloom. So that is supposed to be the peak of physical body maturation. And we've laid down those foundations as strong as they can be. So that's exploring, that's doing keep up with physical fitness and all that sort of stuff. And what we've mentioned beforehand, what happens to a lot of people is the age of 35 to 42, the crisis and questioning. So the thing is going, right, do you know what, this week I'm going out and buy my sports car that I cannot afford. I'm going out to go off with that young female that's like a Playboy bunny type of scenario kind of thing. I don't know what the female perspective of that kind of stuff is, but that's like the stereotypical of man in crisis, isn't it? It's abandon everything, leave the wife, leave the kids, screw it, I'm off.
Are you saying my RX-8 was a midlife crisis car?
Nope.
Good answer.
I've used that as a stereotypical kind of idea, isn't it? I don't know if there's a female equivalent.
No comment.
Then from 42 to 49, it's the soul searching and the wonder of who we are and who we're supposed to be. Yeah. So gone past that midlife crisis, probably bankrupt, got rid of that car, just been repossessed. And the young lady.
Or, yeah, the bankruptcy was probably fairly accurate, and that was just the repair bills to keep it on the road.
Yeah, and that Playboy bunny type lady, she's obviously seen sense and buggered off with somebody more her age, kind of thing. So we move on to 49 to 56, and that is the ever-growing vision and understanding of life. I think that's is, as he says, it's the gift of the 50s is inspiration, mastery, and growing power. We're blessed with a wealth of experience which has given us a certain wisdom. Yeah. 56 to 63 is the crossroads, mastery or re-evaluation. So maybe we've spent decades doing a particular specialized subject, and all to be then is that rug to be pulled from under the feet. So a friend of my mother's, her son was a barrister. I can't remember what field he was in. I think it's commercial law, for argument's sake. And because of his age and his level of qualification, skills, and knowledge, even though he was going for similar jobs, but junior ones for his level, he was never able to get those jobs. So this is going back many, many years, so I don't know what he's doing now. So with that, he may have had to reevaluate who he was and where he wants to be in life, and go from, say, a highly paid QC into a completely different field. And from 63 to 70 is a time of harvesting and spreading the wealth. So give me the money. Yeah. Age 70 then beyond is what was come up in the Erikson's model, is a reflection of, have we led a good life?
Mm.
Have we been good to others? If not, well, tough shit.
It's interesting because these models have been around for quite a while.
Yeah.
And I do think that the age boundaries within them have shifted in recent generations.
Oh, they have, definitely, yeah.
Most definitely shifted.
Because if you look at that, is generationally, it would be, say, great-grandfather at his 20s would be wearing the same, grandfather would be wearing the same clothes in the 20s as what a great-grandfather would be, and all that sort of stuff. And then they would be taking on that form and function of, oh, I've got a backache, oh, I've got this, I've got that. And they'd have that belief of, I got to be like my father was, or I got to be like my mother was, and dress like her and take on the mothering and take on all the other stuff that goes along with that.
Well, I think the other thing is that our experiences in these boundaries and these bands have shifted, so that we're experiencing each of these bands at a later age than we were previously.
Potentially, yeah.
It's almost like, in a way, the maturation is in some ways slowing down, and we're spending longer in each of these phases before moving on and transition to the next.
Well, potentially, yeah.
But when I look at all of these models, you can track almost the development of the component parts of identity through them. You can almost see where the concept of personal boundaries starts to come in, where we're testing and defining those. We can see the scope within those age bands for the beliefs to start to appear, for our values to start to appear. And again, those beliefs and those values, just like identity and our boundaries, they're all changeable. None of those are set in stone.
No.
And it's when those elements are challenged, though, depending on the size of the challenge, can determine the impact it has on the individual, how they respond with that. But without any of those, we really have no sense of who we are.
Yeah. So I think it's on the IEMT course, is Andy Austin was on about one of his clients, and he went through those questions, didn't he, of where is I? And this particular person's that. What are you talking about? She had no sense of individuation because that family had been all-consuming. They had been potentially overprotective, so she wasn't able to develop her own sense of identity away from that group.
And I think this is where there are layers to our identity, and we tap into different parts of our identity, different facets of it, or faces of it at different points. And that means that depending on our community or the network that we're building, because sometimes we will be a member of more than one community now, because the definition of community has changed as well. A community can be a sports club, it can be a hobby group, it can be a shared interest in literature, it can be, a walking group, it can be a job, It
Right.
could be a circle of friends that you've had from early on, or it could be a new circle of friends. Each of those offer a different layer of our identity because we will be different people to a certain extent with each of those clusters,
Yep.
with those communities.
And within our society is when you're meeting people for the first time, please don't you? One of the first questions you get asked is, what do you do then? So our identity gets bound up within our career, and we are not our career, our job. That's something we do to be able to earn money to survive.
Well, I think sometimes there are we have a choice over what our career means to us, whether we make it our purpose or whether we don't. And for some people, they will actively choose to make their career their purpose as an active choice because that aligns maybe with their values, with their ethics, with their belief systems. You see that a lot within things like healthcare, within social care, where there's almost like an ethical choice to go into that career, and that becomes part of that identity because it's so closely aligned. There are other people who allow or choose for their career to become their purpose, maybe not so intentionally, because that's almost an avoidance of something else.
Yeah, well, the typical one is
of the other
talk about, isn't it, is nursing. And it's not a job, it's a vocation. It's something that people do because they really want to do it and really haven't doing it.
Yeah. And you could argue that that the military is like that as well. It attracts people for whom their career is vocational.
And potentially as well, it attracts those of us who could be considered misfits in society. We have no place within a normal ideas of what society or who we're meant to be. So we have to find maybe structure or something else that helps to define who we want to be.
Well, I'm going to take normal out of that.
Well, I'm using
and say actually that sometimes this is where we go looking for a community when we have a disconnect with the average community that we are currently within. And that's a choice over whether or not we choose to conform with the norms of that community and whether those values match with us or not. And if there is a disconnect, then if there's something that offers that pre-built community, that sense of belonging that does fit with our values, then that becomes very attractive.
Can we explore what values are as well, to people who may be not sure what they mean?
So in terms of values, those are things that are almost, you could say, almost like our moral statements, our ethics, the things that are important to us. And when I talk about things that are important to us, I would take that down almost like a behaviors and ethos element. These aren't tangible objects, these are intangible. These are things like honesty, integrity. These are things like
Self-discipline.
Like fairness.
Can these values to a certain extent become all-consuming? So if somebody highly values wealth or money, could that then become all-consuming in the pursuit of that particular thing?
I would say that you can value money without money being a value to you. They're two separate things. And that's where sometimes we almost kind of misplace what's important to us.
Yeah.
And that's that sense of validation
Yeah.
of worth, and we go looking for it in the wrong areas.
Right.
And that becomes something we look for tangibles to demonstrate our worth. We look
Yes.
for tangibles to demonstrate our value, when actually neither of those do.
Yeah. So as we were talking about in the wee hours of this morning, is people will go looking for their validation, their happiness within, say, buying a brand new car.
Yeah.
And within 6 months' time, I go, well, I'm bored of that car now. It's not making, I'm sick of driving it, for argument's sake. Then they'll have to go out and buy another car to validate and keep that level of happiness and going, where that's external validation of something rather than finding that internal, because maybe as a child when they're growing up, they were told, oh, you've done really well and get rewarded with various things.
Well, that comes down to that lovely phrase. There's a very key difference between I'll be happy when,
yeah,
and I'll be happy and.
Yes.
And one is contingent on something else. The other is not.
Yeah. And if that something else doesn't happen, where's that person left?
And there's no guarantee that that tangible thing, that other, that external, is actually going to have enough durability in terms of that happiness generation.
Yeah.
Because what happens when you have it now? And what was the actual driving factor between all that effort? Because you're driving towards the goal. Well, now you have the goal.
Yeah. Oh, what's his name? Matthew Saeed. I can't remember the book that he wrote. He was one of Britain's greatest table tennis players. And he was on about is when people become Olympic champions or champions of any sport, any sporting pursuit, is they've achieved that gold medal, and is that it? There's a massive sense of disappointment, loss, and that kind of thing, even though they've achieved the pinnacle of their activity.
But that's also
where else to, they don't know what else is to be.
But isn't the whole point a part and parcel of what he talks about, the fact the difference between those that transition beyond that military or that Olympic medal is about where their mindset is in terms of their overall plan, their overall purpose. For those that struggle, it's because the purpose is entirely focused on the medal. For those that transition with ease beyond that, is because the medal was just a way marker along the way. The purpose is bigger and beyond that, and it's not all defined by that one element. That one element is not their sole identity.
Yeah, but I think the irony with the pursuit of, say, sporting excellence, they have to have that aim of, I want to win that gold, nobody else can.
But that doesn't preclude the ability to look beyond that, and because that just means that I'm focusing this way marker just now, but there is other goals that I have beyond that are more than just this initial initial medal.
As I say, it's the journey and not the destination.
And that's a bit, again, coming back to that transition stress experience, whether that's military or anywhere else. That again is about where we're placing our purpose. Whether that's so tightly linked to the current, or to that sense of identity that we have now, or have we expanded that to wider territory? That career path, that job, that role, that relationship as just a part of our identity. It's just one element. It's not the sum total of it.
And I think as well is when we do leave, the military or long-term career, our values can possibly change as well.
Well, values are changeable, values are mutable, same as identity and our beliefs. And also purpose, they're all mutable. And that's also where sometimes, and I know we'll talk about this in further episodes, that's where moral injury sometimes has such a massive impact, because it's the biggest challenge to our values. It's the biggest disruptor to our values and beliefs. And that kind of strikes at the very core of our sense of self, a sense of identity.
Yeah.
Because actual job role for most of us is one of the outer layers of our identity. It's not at the core.
So the Japanese also have a way of expressing identity, which is the three faces. And the three faces are, one of the faces is what you show to the outside world and who people see and their perceptions of you and about you. The second face is where your close friends and family know who you kind of are. Again, they have those perceptions of who you are and what your capabilities are, and kind of stuff, and stepping out of that, you may break that mold. And then you have the true face, which is who you really are, and that's your true self-expression, which a lot of people may never ever get to see that or be that. Because maybe there are limitations, and maybe it's a good thing within society, because some people might be serial killers. Their true expression is going around mass murder.
But I think that's also about how many masks we wear. And those are also layers of our identity.
And those we choose to show people.
And some of those masks will be about personas that we adopt with certain groups, certain beliefs that we want them to see or believe that we share with them. And sometimes that means that in the donning of those masks, we will, for a short while, modify our belief structure to fit, to allow us to wear that mask. Because there's not the alignment that we're choosing to let others believe there is. That's where we modify our behaviors, we modify our responses, we modify our language to fit in.
And that could be to the detriment to the self.
It can be incredibly detrimental, because the longer we wear those masks, the further away we become from our own beliefs and values. And it's almost like a gradual dissociation from it.
Yes. Complete, and it ends up complete misalignment and questioning, who am I?
You know, I know certainly at key points in my life where I've reassessed things, there has been that real question of, I actually don't know who I am anymore, because I have, maybe whether through experiences. So for instance, a classic would have been an experience with bullying in a work environment, where my behavior modified consistently to mitigate those actions, to try and resolve those actions, till it got to the point that the modification was such that I actually didn't recognize myself anymore. I didn't know who I was anymore, because of the level of modification I had adapted and adopted to try and resolve this other issue. And in doing so, I had lost touch with my own identity.
And this is what the military do to a certain extent, is mold people into an identity of what they want that person to be.
Yeah, and within the constructs of that, there's a certain element of necessity for it.
Yeah, of course there's, yeah. People have to be able to conform to foreign orders.
Yeah. The challenge lies when you choose to leave that environment
Yeah.
and you don't revert, or you don't know how to revert back, or to how to blend those modifications into something new that allows you to operate in a different country, in a different environment, once you've emigrated from one community to another. And that's where what you and I do comes in.
Yeah.
Which is that realignment of that identity, that values, that beliefs, that purpose, to reshape that sense of self. Because when you redo that, and then you refresh your sense of your own boundaries, that's about placing you as the priority.
Yeah.
And that's about a significant change in mind shift and
It
mindset.
is. Yeah. And we go back to Rudolf Steiner's model as well then. So this has to be done at a younger age. So being that crossroads of mastery and reevaluation. So in force at a certain point, you've come to a mastery of your skill, craft, trade. You're leaving that and you've got to reevaluate who you want to be. So many years ago now, I was chatting to this lad who was a Royal Marine sniper. And he was saying, oh yeah, I was told what a wonderful job and wonderful skill it was to have to be able to do all of this sort of stuff. And then he left. Is that? Oh, what skill? What is the point of learning all this sort of stuff of how to shoot people? Where am I now? What am I doing? You know,
And
it led to a lot of confusion. I think
that's
within
where it's a highly valued skill in one community,
it is
but it's not.
completely useless in another.
But that's also about recognizing the component parts of that skill
Yeah.
and the component behaviors and the transferability, and taking those elements and blending them into something new.
Yeah. And that's what it's about, isn't it? Is integration.
Yeah, it's integration, and it's blending, and it's also the creation as you do that of something new. This
Yeah.
is about trying to fix something. This is about creation.
As I mentioned previously, when I've been chatting to a few people and with myself upon leaving, is never ever wanted to have anything to do with the forces and military again. So it was the kill off, one of a better word, that aspect of us, which we've been doing for so long, which is actually impossible to do. And it's how to then go, yeah, that's not a very useful thing to be doing. Then looking at, okay, I need to reevaluate, and which you just mentioned now, is reblend all that skill set, all that knowledge into making a more of a complete person.
Take the bits and build something new. Allow some of those component parts to increase in size and others to shrink.
Yeah.
And in doing so, you create a different picture, a different identity.
Pardon?
In doing so, you create a different picture, a different identity, because the size of the pieces shift too.
Yeah. So we no longer have that bunny rabbit gnawing at the bits. We are then back at the workshop, remaking our own jigsaw.
Yeah. Well, you're not so much looking at a jigsaw with the bobbly bits blown off. What you're looking at is mosaic tiles and the opportunity to create something really quite unique.
So in summary then, we have been going on for quite a while now, is we've talked through.
Identity is always such an interesting conversation, right?
It is, yeah. Yeah, so we've talked through the Erikson's stage of psychosocial development and how they change us through our years from 0, 23 months, all the way to maturity and death, and how that affects and changes us. Excuse me. As well as Rudolf Steiner's 7 cycles of life. So that happens, yeah. So some say 7, 0 to 7, 7 to 14, etc., etc.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And in amongst that, we've also talked about the component parts of our identity,
Yes.
and the importance of our values, our beliefs, our sense of self, our sense of purpose, and the mutability of those and how those develop and the importance of those.
Yeah. So we really do hope you've enjoyed this episode. And you can find us on Spotify. And I do believe you can now rate on that as well.
Yeah.
All reviews, all ratings would be most appreciated.
You can find us on Apple.
Yeah. And as well is, if you find it's useful, somebody else may find our episodes very useful as well. So please share and like and all that sort of malarkey.
Always, yes.
Yeah, that's the budget.
That is
Thank you very much.
Until next time.
Till next time.